But thanks for the chance to get outside of Washington this morning. It's a real treat to have a view like this. This is not the view I have most mornings as I'm chasing my kids around the kitchen, getting ready to go to work. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to get outside the city and have a conversation today with all of you and take some of your questions and talk about Europe and the transatlantic relationship, which is something that I've focused on for my entire professional career, both in and out of government and in Europe and in the United States. So when I left the White House in 2013, I took some time and went out and met with a number of people that I look up to, mentors, former colleagues, former bosses of mine, and I said, now that I'm leaving government, I've been in government for 5+ years, I'm curious what you think about me returning to the think tank community to focus on Europe. And this was in the summer of 2013. And without missing a beat, every single person that I met with said, Julie, don't go back to working on Europe because there's nothing going on in Europe. And I thought about it for a minute, and everyone said, the only thing that you could possibly do Europe-related right now is this small trade deal, TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and that's so sleepy. And so Europe is just a giant snooze fest, and there aren't any hot issues going on. And I thought, that's an interesting perspective. I took that to heart and thought about it for a minute. And then Michelle Flournoy, a former colleague of mine at the Pentagon, called and said, why don't you come to the Center for New American Security and focus on big questions of grand strategy, relations between China and Russia and the Middle East, and the geopolitics of energy. And that was very attractive to me, and I thought, okay, that could be something new and different, and I won't get trapped focusing on the transatlantic relationship forever, this sleepy relationship. And then, as I settled into my new role and went to CNAS, it was only a few months later, in early 2014, that of course Putin was taking a bite out of Ukraine and annexing Crimea, and we were off to the races. And from there, it was just cascading news at every turn. And I think now we'll all agree that Europe is anything but sleepy. And there is a lot going on. So for a while, both in government and when I exited government, I was feeling like as a big Europeanist, I was kind of starring in Death of a Salesman or something, and no one wanted to focus on Europe anymore. Now we're back. Anyone who knows something about Europe and focuses on the transatlantic relationship is suddenly consumed with all sorts of issues. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about the tectonic shifts that I think are occurring on both sides of the Atlantic and why these shifts will have a major impact on the future of the transatlantic relationship and the future of Europe and on America's role in the world more broadly. So before we get to the transatlantic relationship and Europe's relationship with the United States and kind of hone in on this particular region for a few minutes, and I'll try to be brief because I really want to get to questions. I do want to set the table, and I want to talk about some of the broad geostrategic shifts that I've witnessed and experienced both when I was in government at the Pentagon and the White House and since I've left government. And I just want to make kind of 3 quick points before we dive into the transatlantic relationship. So point 1 is today's security environment has no precedent. I think no single challenge to U.S. interests around the world is equal to what we faced when we were looking at and addressing the Soviet Union during the 20th century, Nazi Germany, or Imperial Japan. But I would argue that the sheer volume and complexity of the challenges and the threats that the United States faces today and all of their interrelationships are at least as daunting as what we faced in the 20th century, if not more so. I think today we face an interconnected web of regional and international challenges that pose unique challenges to policymakers And the toolkit that we've developed for the 20th century challenges is no longer adequate to address today's challenges. So that's point one. Point two is we're now facing, as a country, a growing diversity of actors at all levels. So obviously during the Cold War, we were focused on the nation state, primarily looking at the Soviet Union as our main adversary. And then after the end of the Cold War, we shifted to transnational threats. Things like weapons of mass destruction, failed states, ethnic conflict. Then we started to move into, tragically, the post-9/11 world, where the focus for the United States has been on terrorism for many, many years now. And terrorism stemming primarily from non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and now the Islamic States. Today, we continue to face all of the transnational threats that we talked about in the 1990s, WMD, failed states, ethnic conflict. We continue to face terrorism as a threat, but we've seen the return of great power politics. So we have a resurgent Russia and a rising power, China, on the other side of the Pacific, as well as a number of other countries like India and Indonesia, whose middle class is going to triple in the next 15 years, making it the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world by 2030. Now, not all of these emerging powers that I'm talking about are going to directly impact U.S. interests, or we shouldn't assume we'll necessarily view them as adversaries, but I do think that these countries are working in many cases to revise regional and global structures and orders in ways that directly impact U.S. interests and can make our share of global power diminish ever so slightly. I also think we continue to battle a number of regional adversaries, countries like Iran and North Korea that we can talk about later, that pose major challenges to the United States and obviously are in the headlines on a daily basis right now. So this mix and match of, it's like three-dimensional chess of the great powers, the emerging powers, the resurgent powers, the transnational threats, and the terrorism as a core national security challenge, plus these rogue nations, whatever you want to call them, regional adversaries, it really creates an incredibly complex set of actors which the U.S. government and all of our national security professionals have to respond to, as well as working with our transatlantic partners on a regular basis. Third point I want to make, just to set the table, is all of the groups in the states that I just mentioned are increasingly relying on a long list of asymmetric capabilities and tactics. Tactics that do not involve conventional military forces, so we're not necessarily talking about tanks rolling across a border or bombs dropping out of the air, although in some cases we are. But increasingly we're looking at a nation at things like cyber attacks, energy coercion, strategic communications and disinformation campaigns, anti-access area denial capabilities, such as what the Russians are doing right now in setting up A2AD capabilities along their western periphery. And a lot of these actors are relying on technological advances. For example, if you look at drones that have become easier to access because of an affordability of these technologies and also the proliferation of these types of technologies. And the idea behind these types of tactics is that they often fall just below the threshold for action. So for example, if you look at the NATO alliance knows what to do if tanks roll into Latvia. We've got that. We have a plan for it, we've exercised, we've trained for it for many, many decades. The NATO alliance is not necessarily well equipped to deal with a cyber attack, as was the case in Estonia in 2008. The alliance struggles to develop both the tools and the strategies to deal with these asymmetric tactics and capabilities. So the question here for all of us here today that I want to talk about is, how are Europe and the United States positioned to cope with these challenges? How are the transatlantic partners positioned to cope with this new diversity of actors, these asymmetric capabilities, and the new interconnected web of regional and international challenges and threats? I think my answer in a word is poorly. we are not well equipped to deal with these challenges as partners. And I want to walk you through a couple reasons why I'm feeling a little bit gloomy these days about our prospects to deal with this world that's coming at us pretty quickly and presenting a number of new challenges. So let's start with Europe on the other side of the Atlantic for a minute and have a look at what's going on over there. And there's a lot to cover. So Europe right now, in my mind, is facing this perfect storm of internal and external challenges. I'm going to start with the internal list. So on the internal list, one of the first things that comes to mind, one of the biggest challenges for the continent right now is the migration issue. Over the last couple of years, Europe has had an influx of migrants that has been unmatched since the flow of migrant workers that came in after World War II. They have not seen surges on this scale for many, many decades. And while the flows themselves have stopped, particularly from Syria, although not in all cases, Italy this year has taken in 90,000 refugees so far, coming across the Mediterranean, often up from Libya and North Africa. But while generally we can say that the flows are not nearly as bad as they were in 2015, this migration crisis is starting to pull at the political fabric of Europe and really having an impact on the political landscape, as we saw in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France, in the UK, and it's creating real friction inside the European Union, because the task right now is to resettle many of the refugees that are sitting in countries like Greece and Italy and finding places for them across the European continent. The problem is that some countries, like Hungary and Poland, have determined that they're not going to take any refugees, not a single person. And they believe that that's their sovereign right, and that they do not have to listen to the calls coming out of Brussels or from Berlin in particular to take some of these refugees that continue to flow into Europe or to absorb the ones that are already there. The second challenge that I wanted to mention from an internal perspective is, of course, Brexit. The referendum took place last summer in June of 2016. They have now started the process to remove the United Kingdom from the European Union, a process that they've never gone through in the history of the European Union. It is, in theory, supposed to be finished by March of 2019. They meet on a monthly basis, and right now they are already weeks, if not months, behind. They basically have, in some circles they call them doors, that gates or doors open, they settle one set of issues, the gate opens, they settle the next set of issues. They're still stuck at gate number 1. The first thing that they were supposed to decide on was the fee, the divorce bill. How much should the United Kingdom pay to Brussels for its divorce? As you can imagine, there are lots of different figures and debates going on. The UK has an entirely different version of what that number should be than the folks in Brussels. Some estimates are that it should be somewhere around $100 billion. Others in London have a very much smaller number that they've suggested. But that's one issue that they haven't been able to settle on. The rights of citizens living inside the UK that are EU citizens but not UK citizens, and vice versa. UK citizens living inside the European Union. That has not been settled. Questions of what to do about the single market, the customs union, Ireland, immigration, and the role of the European Court of Justice. So they have made almost no progress. There's been a lot of bluster. Obviously, Theresa May has called a snap election that didn't quite go as planned. It has weakened her hand. She has deep divisions with her own cabinet, most notably her foreign minister, on whether or not this should be a hard or soft exit. And so what this is triggering is a total distraction among the folks in Brussels and among our closest allies and most capable allies in London. I was there 2 weeks ago. Every conversation I had about North Korea, Russia, Iran, Islamic State, ended by talking about Brexit. Whatever the topic was, about 15 minutes into the conversation, somebody wanted to blow off steam or tell me why Brussels was wrong on a particular issue. And so this is a distraction for us as partners, that we have one of our most capable allies entirely checked out and consumed with this process. Second thing I wanted to mention about what's going on in the European continent is not just the hard exit of a country determining that it's going to leave the European Union, but we have a number of countries across the European continent, 2 in particular right now, that are kind of experiencing what I call kind of a soft exit, in the sense that they're not really leaving the European Union. Poland and Hungary are still members of the European Union, but what those countries are doing is that they're ever so slowly drifting away from the value set and the criteria that they had to meet to become members of the European Union 20-some years ago. And so as those countries start to make internal decisions about the rule of law, in particular, human rights and other issues, they're creating a dilemma for the policymakers in Brussels to determine how do we deal with countries that are backing away from our value set and the pillars of that hold up the European project. And right now, because Brussels is so consumed with Brexit, it hasn't really adequately found a way to deal with Orban or what's transpired in recent years in Poland. But this will continue to be a challenge for European unity and the future of the European Union. And it will also have a challenge for Macron and Merkel that have a vision of developing this kind of multi-speed Europe, where France and Germany are able to move together and move more quickly to take decisions for a small group of countries inside the European Union, and others could potentially be left behind. And so we'll have to wait to see kind of how this plays out on the European continent. The last thing I wanted to mention on the internal front, in terms of what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic, and this, you mentioned this earlier in your opening remarks, is the rise of populist parties across the European continent. None of these parties so far have been able to take over an entire country. We don't have a situation where the Alliance for Germany, the AfD, the FarRight Party that gained so much ground in the recent German election, is now in charge of selecting the Chancellor for Germany. But the AfD is entering the German Bundestag for the first time in Germany's history since the end of World War II. And so at this point, we're now seeing a far-right party have far more influence than it ever has in many, many decades. They got 13% of the vote in the last election, and they'll be ever present. There'll be almost 80 members of the AfD in the German Bundestag with full-time staff. They'll create their own political foundation. Every political party gets to create a foundation to promote its ideas. It will have a much stronger voice in Germany than it ever has before. Similarly, Marine Le Pen is not the head of France, but her party, the National Front, did very well in the French election. Not well enough to be the victor at the end of the day, but again, the forces that brought some of these parties forward are not going away. Whether it's disaffection with globalization, identity politics, concerns about immigration, an anti-EU sentiment, whatever it is, those winds will keep blowing, and we'll see and feel the impact of that for years to come. They're not going away. Now, what's happening externally in Europe? Externally, Russia, for the last couple of years, has been doing everything it possibly can to actively undermine the European project, to divide Europe from within, and support some of these populist parties, either by supporting them directly. Marine Le Pen got most of her, at least a third of her campaign funding from Russia, or buying up media markets in Italy or Latvia or elsewhere to impact and have an influence on political debates in some of these countries on the other side of the Atlantic. Russia not only is undermining democracies across Europe, it is redrawing the borders of Europe, as we saw with Russia going into Ukraine in 2014. But we also saw Russia go into Georgia in 2008. Let's not forget that they're still there. It is weaponizing information, intimidating our allies on a regular basis by flying into their airspace and coming dangerously close to both military aircraft and commercial aircraft. And it has significantly modernized its forces in recent years, despite some very tough economic indicators inside Russia. It has not stopped Putin from modernizing, particularly its ground forces and its maritime forces. Last point I want to say on the external front is the series of terrorist attacks that we've seen on the other side of the Atlantic. These are either conducted by foreign fighters that left European soil to go join the fight in Iraq and Syria, and they're now returning to Europe, or in some cases these are just lone wolves or folks that are inspired or in some cases directed by the Islamic State to undertake attacks on the European continent. Just to name a few, we had Paris in November of 2015, Brussels in March of 2016, Nice July 2016, Berlin December 2016, and a series of attacks in London, including one just a few weeks ago when I was there on the tube. So these terrorist attacks obviously are having a tremendous impact on the political debates, on the public's fear towards terrorism, worries about terrorism, worries about radicalization, and have been consuming policymakers on the other side of the Atlantic for some time. So that, in a snapshot, is where we are on the European front, and you can see that they have a lot coming at. It's not sleepy on the other side of the Atlantic, and these European leaders, very few of whom I would count as a big global leader on the world stage, are really struggling to cope with all of these challenges, both internally and externally. So what's happening on our side of the Atlantic? I don't have to tell you what's happening here. Our election obviously represented some of the trends and some of what we saw in European elections. So we too have seen this disaffection with globalization, hyper-partisanship and big heated debates about the future of immigration. Big questions about mainstream politics and the establishment, the swamp, a desire for radical change, a protest vote. All of what we saw kind of come to the surface in our own election last fall is being replicated, and some of the same debates and the same trends on the other side of the Atlantic. So we are both struggling with this, and I think we're kidding ourselves to assume that it'll be a passing fad. I think some of these forces will be with us for quite some time. We're also having very heated debates in Congress and across the United States on healthcare, on a variety of economic issues, trade issues, and a strong pull to focus on issues at home, which I think is why Trump's message about America First resonated so well with many Americans, because there's this feeling that the United States in particular has done too much. That we're tired of carrying everyone else's burden, and that we have to free ourselves, particularly of the burden of carrying for Europe's security, and let them step up and do more for their own defense and on the security front. And then, like Europe, we're also feeling Russian aggression. Russia buzzes our ships in the Black Sea, comes close to our military aircraft and air policing mission over the Baltic states or over Iceland. It interfered in our own election, and like in Europe, is pursuing a whole array of disinformation tactics on a regular basis through social media and other tools that they have at their disposal. And so the question is, can Europe and the United States lift their heads out of these internal debates, the forces, the winds that are blowing inside our societies, the public? Can we cope with these public debates, kind of the generational shifts also that have pulled away from the transatlantic relationship? And can we turn our attention to developing better tools and strategies to cope with what's on the world stage right now, whether it's Iran or North Korea or Russia or terrorism or any of the things that we've talked about here this morning. And what worries me is that the institutions that we built over the last 70 years, and there's a whole alphabet soup of institutions that we've built together, whether it's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, the NATO alliance, the European Union, which we're not a member of, but in a way is part of an American project to bring stability across the European continent, or the UN, all of these institutions were not designed to deal with the threats that we're facing today. They were built in an entirely different era, and for that reason, many of these institutions feel creaky and rusty and outdated to deal with little green men running into Crimea, or cyber attacks, or disinformation campaigns, or energy coercion. And so a lot of Americans, I think, and Europeans are asking themselves, well, does it matter? Do we need to be the world's policeman? Do we need to take on all of these challenges? Is transatlantic leadership that important? After all, we have resource constraints. There are limits to US power, to European power. Americans want to focus on those challenges at home. And I think it does matter. I'm one of the people out there that believes that the transatlantic partners are in a very unique position, particularly the United States, that has many unique attributes. We have a strong and dynamic economy, still have a lot of work to do, but we've shown that it's a very dynamic economy. We have world-class alliances, alliances that Russia and China only wish that they had across the entire globe. We have a world-class military. We have the ability to build global coalitions on the fly, whether it's the coalition to cope with the Islamic State or the coalition to fight Ebola. And we have soft power in our values, the values that we share with our European allies, that allow us to shape the global environment and secure our interests. I think when we talk about America's engagement and the transatlantic partnerships engagement in the world, I think sometimes it can be confused immediately. Well, Julie, what you're promoting is another Iraq, long-term military, multi-year military invasion, intervention of some kind. And I think we have to get out of the frame of thinking about engagement in the world only as a military operation. I think in the Cold War, for example, we were able to use proxies and limited intervention in very effective ways. We don't and we cannot dictate every single policy outcome in the world, nor should we. But I think the question here today is, do we want China to be the country that's going to be setting the norms around the world? Or do we want to continue to set those norms and provide global leadership with our European allies? So for me, again, I think we have plenty of work to do as transatlantic partners. I think we have to do more to help our European allies and work with them to develop the policies and the strategies that we're going to need for this century. We do have to make the world order more inclusive, but we have to make sure that it represents our values at the same time. We have to position these institutions like NATO, like the UN, to better cope with the new challenges out there. We have to work on our ability to assess risk and prepare for new contingencies. I do think we have to develop some new trade agreement with Europe. I don't know what that's going to look like, knowing that TTIP is off the table. But I think Europe and the United States, that trade relationship is the biggest in the world and continues to serve both our interests very well. And I think we do have to think about how we're going to together cope with the post-manufacturing world. So this is a tall order for the transatlantic partners. We have plenty to do. But what I try to advocate when I go out and meet with groups like this is that we shouldn't lose faith in our European partners. We have to be reminded about what this relationship brings to both of us. And we have to continue to make the investments we need to make this relationship vibrant and effective to deal with today's challenges. So with that, I'll close out, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Julie, you read today that the number of staff positions, especially in the State Department, are just not been filled. And trying to deal with any one of these issues is daunting, to say the least. Who's going to do the homework on this?
Well, I get that question a lot from a lot of the embassies in town, and not just European embassies, but our friends in Australia or Korea or Latin America, wherever it might be. I think our partners are looking for, where's the door they knock on. And right now, because we don't have the assistant secretaries in place, or the undersecretaries in place at the State Department, and there are open-ended questions if they'll ever be there or arrive on the scene, it is very hard for our foreign partners to engage with the United States right now. They do have the National Security Council up and running, and I know the folks over there have made themselves available to our foreign partners, and they continue to try to drive policy forward. But if you think about something like the North Korea crisis, or even where we're going to go now with the Iran deal if the president refuses to certify, I think there are open-ended questions about where the long-term, even the medium-term strategy is going to be developed. So we have not had an ambassador in South Korea. We have not had an assistant secretary for Asia at the State Department. Those are the types of individuals that would take the big policy pronouncements by the president or by the Secretary of State or any other cabinet member and turn it into actual policy and meet with their interagency counterparts and then meet with their foreign counterparts. And because those individuals are not home and not present, it is a gap that's felt. And I think they've struggled to make do at the Pentagon. They have a couple of deputy assistant secretaries that are there, but we don't even have a deputy assistant secretary for the Middle East right now in the Pentagon. And we've got a couple of people scurrying around trying to make do, but it's very challenging. I know Brian Hook quite well, who's the head of policy planning at the State Department. That guy, I mean, he must be sleeping 3 hours a night at this point because he's trying to he's doing the best he can. He's a very capable guy. I think the world of him. But for him to take on the world as one individual and try and provide that guidance to Tillerson right now is just an enormous undertaking. So this is a concern I have. It's a concern, again, that's raised by our allies. And frankly, I think our adversaries are looking and thinking, this is a nice opportunity. America doesn't quite have its A game on right now. It's a little distracted, more than a little distracted, and that presents opportunities for us. And it always presents opportunities for us. So in any administration, that first year is horrible because the Senate confirmation process is just a nightmare, and in my mind moves far too slowly. But this time it's on steroids because of the administration's decision, Tillerson's decision in particular, to move forward with this restructuring. And it's still an open-ended question about what the end result will be. The last thing I'll say is, irrespective of what restructuring you want to do, it seems to me like you're going to need a regional assistant secretary for the Middle East and Asia. Those are two positions I think we can all kind of agree on are pretty necessary right now. And maybe they want to get rid of the human rights stuff and democracy promotion. They seem less interested in that. That's their prerogative. Something I disagree with, but that's their choice. But from a regional perspective, it seems to me like getting in those regional assistant secretaries would be a top priority, and I'm a little bit, I'm astounded that that hasn't happened yet.
I have a question about, you mentioned that you didn't see any major leaders in Europe. Okay. What about Angela Merkel and Macron? You don't see them as global leaders at this point?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it is a little bit unfair. I don't see. Oh, I'm so sorry. Question about where are the leaders in Europe? And I was pretty pessimistic in my opening remarks about Europe lacking a group of leaders that can carry this relationship forward. And he was asking about Merkel and Macron in particular. Now Merkel, I wouldn't give up on Merkel. She's going to be consumed over the next couple of months with building this coalition with two parties that can agree on nothing. So she's going to build this coalition with the FDP, the Liberals, and the Greens. This is the most bizarre group of political parties coming together that I've ever seen. The Greens and the FDP, you could take Merkel's party completely out of it, the Christian Democrats, and just focus on the Greens and the FDP. I mean, it is hard for me to find an issue where they're going to see eye to eye. So just imagine what she's in for. On the other hand, Merkel has 12 years of experience being chancellor. It's nothing to belittle. She is a total pragmatist. She has shown herself to be an incredible navigator of difficult political situations. So I'm not giving up on her, but I do think that her hands are going to be tied in ways that they weren't in past coalitions. The Grand Coalition was challenging, but this coalition will be more challenging for her, in my mind. And then once they're in power, they have to, and they settle on the coalition and their agenda, and all the personalities shake out into various positions. They then are coping with a new opposition force in the Bundestag. And don't forget that Germany, to undertake military missions overseas, always has to seek the approval of the German parliament. And the AFD, it's going to be interesting to see how they navigate questions of the future of the European Union, defense policy in Germany, defense spending in Germany, economic reform. I mean, they're going to be faced with a formidable kind of opposition in the parliament that will also prove to be problematic. But I would still keep Merkel at the top of my list as one of the shining stars. She has shown herself to be very innovative. She brings ideas to the table. She's not just a naysayer. She is very crafty in the way she navigates domestic politics. She's pretty tough. So I think we will continue to see leadership from Germany on certain sets of issues. She's always been the reluctant leader. I loved, one of their slogans was, leading from the center, which I guess beats our leading from behind. But still, it was interesting to see her kind of promote that as a concept, that Germany is always in the center of kind of multilateral efforts, and they never really want to go it alone in any case, and yet Europe looks to her often for leadership on a number of issues. So Merkel I would put down, and then Macron I think has some promise. His numbers, his polling numbers at home have been very low. Kind of the honeymoon period came and went very quickly. But on the other hand, you know, he just gave the speech at the Sorbonne. If you haven't had a look at it, it's worth a read. Very ambitious vision of where he wants to take Europe and address some of the fundamental problems with the European project that they've known to be true for several decades now. How he's going to accomplish this with Merkel as she has one hand tied behind her back, I'm just not sure. But I still put more faith in those two than any other set of leaders across the entire continent. And certainly Theresa May doesn't make the list because she's now in a very weak position and is absolutely consumed with Brexit. And they try to send delegations to Washington all the time to persuade us that, you know, they'll be a stronger partner than ever before, but frankly, I don't think many people in the administration or many people on the outside really believe them, because you can feel just how distracted they are on a regular basis. Yeah.
Is there a discernible China strategy in the EU, or have they pretty much abandoned the EU for the rest of the world and let Russia create the havoc?
Question about the EU's policy on China. I think initially when we rolled out the ever-famous pivot to Asia that never quite happened in the Obama administration, we had two sets of reactions from our European allies. So we had a number of Europeans walk in the door and say, oh my God, pivot sounds like you're pivoting away. You know, it means Europe doesn't matter. We don't sit at the heart of US foreign policy anymore. You're going to take all this forced posture out of Europe, you're going to leave us in the dust. But then there were, after the fear, they got over their initial concerns about what this meant for them, increasingly we were finding ourselves having dialogues with our European partners about what their role could be in the pivot to the Pacific and whether or not they wanted to find new avenues of cooperating with the United States on different pieces of the agenda, whether it was diplomacy. Obviously they're not going to be sailing ships into the South China Sea. I mean, they don't even have barely any ships that could make it that far, but above and beyond the defense piece of it, we were having some really fruitful and interesting conversations about work that they could do either in training forces for humanitarian disasters or doing some interesting diplomatic work, supporting transitions in Burma, developing new trade relationships. I mean, obviously we realized we were competitors, but we also appreciated that there were opportunities for cooperation. And so there was this little flicker of light for it was a flash, for a short period of time where there seemed to be some prospect of cooperation, both from individual countries that wanted to take a stronger role in Asia and from the European Union itself. But it came and went quickly because of all of these internal challenges that began to bubble to the surface. And whether it was what Russia was doing or the migration crisis, some very weak economies in Europe for a while, although they look a little bit better these days. But there were the sand started to shift internally in Europe that started to pull us away from the subject of Asia. And even in the United States, we found we couldn't extract ourselves from Iraq and Afghanistan in ways that we thought. You know, the Middle East and Europe were just going to pull us towards that side of the globe, irrespective of what lofty goals we had on the other side of the Pacific. So I don't see a lot of conversation now about it, and in terms of the EU driving policy forward, it does appear increasingly it's kind of every man for himself, that most countries believe that they need to pursue their own bilateral deals. I mean, Merkel goes over with these massive, you know, taking 200 business leaders over to China in a single flight, and taking a really aggressive posture versus some of the other leaders. So it seems like that's not ripe for either a big concerted European approach, because they're so embroiled in their own internal crises now, and it's not part of the transatlantic dialogue, because we want to talk about Iran, Islamic State, Russia, North Africa. I mean, there's so many other things to be discussing. Yeah.
Most of Turkey is not in Europe. And it does sometimes feel that for a long time they've been their own problem, but how do they play in your mind, or do they, into this question?
Well, we're kind of, it's hard to say all time, because Turkey's relationship with Europe and its relationship with the United States, it's been cyclical for a long time. Just with Erdogan alone, we've gone through many ups and downs, but we're really at a low point right now. There's been a lot of bilateral friction, particularly between Turkey and Germany, kind of a war of words, Turkey and the Netherlands, Turkey, Denmark, Turkey, Brussels. So somehow they've managed to keep this migration deal intact, which was breathtaking. I mean, Merkel went down at the height of the migration crisis and kind of unilaterally negotiated this deal where the European Union would issue payments to Turkey. They have close to 3 million migrants now residing in Turkey. And that there was an agreement that as people showed up on the shores of Greece, they would be returned to Turkey, and the European Union would develop a proper way to process some of these individuals and bring them into Europe. There have been complaints. Turkey complains they haven't received payment quickly enough, or it was the wrong amount of money, or, you know, but no one has blown up the deal, and Merkel has been heavily criticized by her European partners for kind of negotiating this on her own, which is so unlike her. Again, leading from the center, she didn't exactly do that on the migration crisis, but I think she was feeling a little bit desperate and the need to move quickly. So the shiny, happy part of the story for Europe, at least, and frankly for us too, because we don't want to see Europe destabilize any further, is that the migration deal is holding, which is nothing short of a small miracle, and has had a major impact on the migration flow across Europe. What's not going well is that Erdogan, obviously, what he's doing at home is just horrifying. I mean, completely rolling back human rights. I mean, the list of human rights abuses, locking up journalists, what he's done with protesters, what he's done with folks on social media. I mean, it's horrifying. And frankly, neither the United States nor Europe, we've been able to lift up our heads and have like a concerted effort to deal with what he's doing at home. At the same time, he's doing things like, I mean, despite the fact that Turkey shot down a Russian jet not so long ago for flying into its airspace, where the friction between Moscow and Ankara was just off the charts, now there's like this total love fest. really cozying up to the Russians in ways that are not helpful for us. They've just taken a decision to buy S-400s, air defense system that's not going to be compatible with the NATO alliance, and is really creating friction with the Pentagon. And so Erdogan is like deliberately poking a stick in our eye kind of at every turn. And yet, he knows he can get away with a lot because we need Turkey for lots and lots of reasons. Most notably because most of the flights, most of the deployments over Iraq and into Syria stem from bases in Turkey. So from a counterterrorism and an Islamic State perspective, I mean, we need Turkey more than ever, and he knows that. And so we are all in this awful predicament. We're distracted, we don't have a strategy, we're bickering with each other at home, we don't have people in place at the State Department, and so Erdogan's kind of up to no good. And what I worry about is that this relationship will unwind. Now his prospects always to join the European Union were low, now they're like in the hole. And so I don't know what the future holds. How much longer will we be able to just muddle through and turn a blind eye to what he's doing at home on the domestic front for the sake of maintaining this national security relationship? And how low is he going to go? What more is coming? And what other relationships, you know, what will he do if we do decertify the Iran deal? How does Turkey's relationship with Iran come into play? I mean, there's all sorts of things that are, you know, it's a very fast-moving set of relationships. But it worries me a great deal, so I'm glad you brought up Turkey. Yes?
I'm concerned about what's happening in Europe between the pound and the euro and the dollar. It
Yeah.
seems to me that we're gravitating to a point where financially the whole thing may not make any sense, you know, economically, which is what the thing is all about to begin with. So are there ways that this thing may actually unravel and get reversed? And how might that scenario look to you?
Well, it's hard to figure out how we would unravel the entire project, the entire Eurozone and the European Union more broadly. I mean, it's not impossible. Frankly, if Marine Le Pen had won, I think she would have held a referendum on EU membership in France. And if she had done that, and if it had gone the wrong way in my mind, with France exiting, these are all big ifs. But I think then if you had another big power in Europe having a referendum like the UK, I think it would be the end of the project. I don't think you can sustain it. I think they'll, I hope, survive this exit on the part of the United Kingdom. And it has spurred, in a surprising way, it has spurred a little bit more cohesion and a sense of desperation. I don't think most leaders in Europe, their publics may disagree, I don't think most leaders in Europe want to see the whole thing disappear into a big, you know, puff of smoke. But yeah, I could sit here and probably outline a couple of scenarios of how it could go south, but frankly, I wouldn't put big chances on that happening. I think the Eurozone will survive, but I think it may bring some really negative economic ramifications, kind of what the coming years they're going to bring for the broader transatlantic relationship. Yeah. Okay.
You talked about Russia and its offensive measures that it's used in Europe, whether it's supporting, you know, coup plots or propaganda through social media, changing borders. And we have responded, the United States and Europe, with placing brigades that move around. We've imposed sanctions. But what more should we be doing?
Well, you're right. We do have multinational battalions in the 3 Baltic states. We have a rotational presence now in Poland that's significant. And as someone who fought for us not to take the brigade combat teams out of Europe in 2012, I'm glad to see some U.S. posture returning to the region and to the neighborhood. And the sanctions have been important. And frankly, I've been surprised by how many years we've been able to maintain unity with our European partners that are facing tremendous pressure at home to lift sanctions. But we've kept those on, I hope they'll stay, because they are having an impact. We haven't stopped Russia's bad behavior, but I do think from an economic standpoint, Russia is feeling it. And I think they're starting to understand the costs of staying inside Ukraine finally. But in terms of what we do going forward, I have been an advocate of providing legal support to the Ukrainians. I disagreed with my own administration on that point. It's something we opted not to do. I know Secretary Mattis was recently in Ukraine talking about that option again, defensive lethal weapons for the Ukrainians. I think enhanced deterrence in the 3 Baltic states continues to be a priority. The Trump administration is supporting the presence that we have, but I'd like to see it put in the base budget. So I think that's a change we could make. I also think we have to do more to reinforce the battalions that are there. Frankly, if the Russians came tomorrow, it would be very hard for us to reinforce those battalions. We haven't really focused on questions of readiness in ways that we should as partners, so there's more to do in that regard. I think command structure reform inside the NATO alliance is something that we can focus on to make the alliance more effective and more responsive to deal with challenges that Russia poses both in the air, ground, and at sea. And the last thing I'll say is we've done very little work in the North Atlantic, but Russian subs have been showing up with increasing frequency in the North Atlantic in ways that really worry me. That's an area we haven't focused on since the Cold War. The old GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, the body of water up there in the North Atlantic was a key focal point for us during the Cold War, but we no longer have the anti-submarine warfare capabilities or the sensors we need in that area. So I'd like to see us, in addition to focusing on the Nordic-Baltic space, focus increasingly on the North Atlantic. And then the last, sorry I said last, but the very last thing I'll mention is Europe and the United States, we have to start sharing more lessons on these disinformation campaigns. We're just starting to unpack what Russia is doing and how it's penetrating social media networks and all the rest. Europe is doing the same but has more experience with it. And so I think we need to start having a better conversation about A, what have you experienced, and B, what tools have you developed to try and counter some of these campaigns? And we're just literally just scratching the surface. We just have not even started to fully appreciate what's going on here. And that's going to be the project going forward with our transatlantic partners. So, thank you. Thank you very much.